My name is Calvin Mitchell. I am the assistant curator here at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this, what I consider a wonderful show, a wonderful lecture, I should say. For those of you that may not be aware, we do have a brochure that identifies the lectures and book signing events that started in early September and will continue through early October. This happens to be our second evening event, and next week we're also going to have a book signing and lecture on the 6888. This was a battalion of African American females who were stationed in during the European Theater of Operations. This program, the lecture tonight, along with the lectures in this series, I'd like to acknowledge the funding that we received from the African American, the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, and also it's in recognition of our exhibit relating to the centennial of the national parks. Trailblazing 100 years of our national parks, and I do hope that at some point that you guys will be able to visit our exhibition as well. I want to say that unfortunately we were planning to have a book signing ceremony for Mr. Powell, but the books haven't arrived. There is one consolation, however. Mr. Powell will be again talking with us on Saturday, and that will be from 1 to 2:30. So hopefully we expect to have the books available for his signing and for purchase as well. Now, tonight, Mr. Powell is going to talk about the Buffalo Soldiers, basically serve as a primer, and the role they played in our national military history. The second lecture, consistent with the theme of our exhibition, Mr. Powell will be discussing the role of the Buffalo Soldiers during the inception of our national park system. And they played a very significant role in the national parks. And I'm not trying to give away Mr. Powell's lecture, but one of the early black officers, Colonel Young, served at he was head of Sequoia National Park, and at that time he was often referred to as the first manager of the National Park Service because of his extensive deployment there with the national parks. Just a little bit about Mr. Powell, and also I'd like to acknowledge the presence of his wife, Christine. I probably would regard, well, let me give you a little anecdotal story. So when we started to organize this series of events, I approached Shelton Johnson, and some of you may have seen him. He was the Black National Park Ranger who was featured in the documentary on the national parks. And so I approached him about giving this lecture. So he said, no, I won't be able to make it. So I said, well, who would you recommend to be your substitute? And without a doubt, I mean, without hesitancy, he said, Anthony Powell. So I am glad and I think we're glad and very fortunate to have Mr. Powell here. He probably is regarded as probably the foremost expert on the Buffalo Soldiers. So we've got somebody who knows what to talk about. By way of introduction, Mr. Powell is a retired Army officer, and as I indicated, he's regarded as probably the nation's expert on the Buffalo Soldiers. He probably has the largest collection of African American military memorabilia outside of a museum, actually probably including museums. And he's got, in talking with him earlier, he said he has over 500 military uniforms. what can I say? And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that he brought the uniform that was worn by his grandfather, who happened to have been a Buffalo soldier as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to allow the distinguished lecturer, Mr. Powell, to take over. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Powell.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Those of you in the back, you know we have seats up here and I don't bite. You know, it reminds me of some of my students that always want to sit way in the back, but come up to the front, if you will. You know, I'm 70 and I can't see as good as I used to, so if you'd come up, that would be great. As Kelvin said, my name is Anthony Powell. I've been doing this for almost 50 years. I was fortunate enough to get involved through a person who was related to me, my grandfather. And my grandfather, I got a chance to live with he and my grandmom when I was 10 years old in Los Angeles. My grandfather had served 40 years in the Army. That's a picture of him, taken just about the turn of the century. For the Love of Liberty talks about the African-American soldier and his contribution to American history and military history for sure. When I was about 14 years old, thinking that I knew everything in the world, I asked my grandfather one day, I said, well, Granddad, very politely, why did you serve this racist country for 40 years? And, you know, he looked at me and stared me down. And I told him, I need to know. And he told me something that it took me a couple of years to fully appreciate, but something I've never forgotten. He said the Army gave him the only part of the American dream that the nation would let him share in. Now, my first response in the late 50s was, oh my God, Granddad's and Uncle Tom. And it took me a couple of years to fully appreciate what my grandfather meant. Well, my grandfather was a totally illiterate country boy from Tennessee when he talked his way into the Army at almost 14 years old in 1887. Now, the Army gave him something that would become a standby for people, irregardless of color, who were trying to get a way up and a way out. The first thing it gave my grandfather was something that we all look for in life. What do you think that might be? Some of you already know, but the audience, what do you think that might be? Something that we look for in life. Freedom, yes. Purpose, yes. You know, the Japanese has a phrase, it's called jiwa. Money, okay? It gave my grandfather economic stability, more than just money, but economic stability. Someone said purpose. Yes, it gave him a purpose. If you had known my grandfather, you would have never knew that he was a totally illiterate country boy from Tennessee. If you saw him and talked to him, you'd have thought, well, at least this guy got a high school education, maybe even a couple of years of college. But not at all. All of his education was in the Army. Because, you know, as far as public education was concerned, it was hit and miss. But the Army's education for its soldiers was something that was stressed, and illiterate soldiers had to go to school. And that included black and white illiterate soldiers. And my grandfather was among the many that learned going to school. But it gave him something else that I think for his generation was very important. Do you know what that might be? Not just economic stability, but an opportunity. Well, let me put it this way. You know, the Army used to use the phrase, join the Army and see the world. Can you imagine in 1887 a person of color, irregardless of what color that may be, whether it is black, brown, white, yellow, doesn't matter. It gave a person of color an opportunity to do things that outside of that structure would have been an impossibility to do. And you say, well, how did he see the world? Well, my grandfather saw the world, number one, by getting the heck out of Memphis, Tennessee, and going out west. Ironically, my grandfather fought against Native Americans in the late 1880s. He was in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He served in the Philippines 4 tours of duty, starting in 1899 and ending in 1915. He was in Mexico chasing Pancho Villa in 1916 with the American Expeditionary Force of the 10th Cavalry. He also served in World War I in France, and he was in probably a little-known war that we were involved in. We called it the Midnight War. It was our involvement in the Russian Revolution. My grandfather was stationed with a group of quartermaster units in Vladivostok, and he would be there from 1919 to 1920. So overall, my grandfather had an opportunity of doing things, seeing things, and being something that for his age and for his social standing would have almost been an impossibility. So when I asked my grandfather, well, how could you serve? Well, he said it was quite simply the only part of the American dream. And we Americans have offered that dream to a universe of people in our world. And for my grandfather, it was something that he cherished his whole life, being a part of that American dream. So I'm going to start the slide. So when you go and see the slides that I have, my grandfather was a photographer. I might as well tell you that story. In 1889, he was stationed at Fort Robinson, Nebraska with the 9th Cavalry. And the post photographer was a retired German Civil War veteran, okay, who took a liking to this 14-year-old and taught him the art of photography. I have over 10,000 images that my grandfather took over the course of his 40 years in the Army. And you know the thing that it does more than anything else? It gives you a picture of life of an American soldier that you don't see or you don't read in a lot of books to this day. And I think that is the thing that my grandfather captured, an almost forgotten part of American history, and especially dealing with the average American soldier. Do you know when the first African American soldier became a soldier in the regular Army? Anyone? This is open for anyone. Okay, speak up. Oh, no, much later. No, earlier than that. Earlier than that. A couple more years from 64? 66. 1866, after the Civil War, Congress authorized for the first time African American soldiers to be a part of the regular establishment. Now, is that to suggest that they did not serve in the Army before? No, it did not. Because black soldiers served under the British during the colonial period and the different involvements that they had with Native Americans. They served throughout the Revolutionary War on both sides, both the British and the American side. They served in the War of 1812. They served in the Mexican-American War. And they served in the big war that America had, the American Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, Congress finally decided that we're going to use these men. And for the next 150 years, African American soldiers would be a part of the regular establishment. Yes? You have something you need to say? You know, over the years, I've heard folklore as to what African American soldiers received when they became regular soldiers. Have any of you heard any of that folklore? They got the worst horses, they got the worst equipment, they got all of these bad things. True, but not true. African American soldiers received the same equipment that all American soldiers received. And what equipment do you think that was? That was the cast-off equipment of the Civil War. And that included horse flesh, equipment, armament, and uniforms. Okay? That's a fact. It wasn't until 1872 that America rearmed its army. And for the first time since the beginning of the Civil War, America's army was, refurbished as an army of the 19th century. African American soldiers received the same arms, same equipment as all American soldiers did. And that's a fact. The rest of what you may have heard is folklore. Because at the end of the Civil War in the American West, do you think all of the forts were occupied and had just beautiful things all around them? Of course not. Most of the forts in the Southwest had been abandoned, okay? And so those had been dilapidating forts since the beginning of the Civil War. And so when we reoccupied those forts, all American soldiers had to do the same thing. They had to rebuild the encampments, they had to reoccupy them. And black soldiers did the same thing that white soldiers did. They lived in the same dirty forts. They helped build forts throughout the West or rebuild them. But that was the thing that all soldiers had to do. Now, you might say, well, I've heard all of these stories about how black soldiers were treated. I'm not here suggesting that black soldiers were treated better than anyone else, because in many cases they were not. But they were soldiers. And when they put on that uniform, what do you think it made them feel like? I interviewed over the course of my years of research hundreds and hundreds of soldiers that served from the late 1890s to after the Korean War. And I would ask all of these guys, say, why did you join the Army? One old man told me, he said, it was the uniform. And I said, what do you mean? It's a piece of cloth, the uniform. But he said, the feeling that it gave me. Harken back to what my grandfather had said. The only part of the American system, the American dream, that they were able to share. And so the uniform was something that they wore with pride. Many of you have probably heard the story of how Buffalo soldiers got their name. Can anyone tell me how that happened? Okay, I've heard that one too. Anybody else? Oh, don't be bashful. A wrong answer is not necessarily a wrong answer. Okay. You must have talked to me before. The truth behind how they got the name Buffalo Soldiers, and the first Native Americans to apply that name to them were Cheyennes, okay? Before that, they were called black white men because they were doing the same thing white people were doing, taking Native American land and killing them. But in each of the warrior clans of the Southwest, of Montana, there was a clan called the Clan of the Buffalo Warrior. And only the fiercest of the warriors were allowed in the Buffalo Clan. When they ran into my grandfather's generation of American soldiers, these were fierce warriors likened to the Buffalo Clan, ergo, Buffalo Soldier. Now, it's true their hair was nappy and the buffalo's mane is a little nappy, but they got the name because of the respect that Native Americans had for that honored beast, the buffalo, and the Buffalo Warrior Clan. Now, am I suggesting that black soldiers were these honorable guys that didn't kill Native Americans and didn't put them on the reservation? Absolutely not, because they did. It was part of their job. Now, am I suggesting that that was the right thing to do? Well, history has shown that maybe it wasn't, okay? But that was a job that they were paid to do. And so, indeed, they subjugated Native Americans and kept them on the reservation. But you know one interesting story, and I've recounted every engagement between the end of the Civil War to 1893, 83 to 90% involved African American soldiers. And guess what? There is not one occurrence of indiscriminate killing and massacring of Native Americans by these soldiers. Not one. Again, I'm not suggesting that they did not kill Native Americans, because they did. That was the lot of a soldier of that time. But they did not have the same attitude that the average American had. And you know what that attitude was? The only good Indian is a dead Indian. They did not have that attitude. And why do you suppose they did not have that attitude? Speak up. That's right. Absolutely. And they were treated truly bad, just as the Native Americans over the course of time had been treated. Now, am I suggesting or saying that all black soldiers were John Wayne riding to the rescue in that white hat and good guys? No, I am not. Because my research has shown me that they were just men. Good, bad, and different. Okay? Just as we are today. There were no gods. They were no superheroes. They were men that lived during a time that their careers afforded them opportunities to move forward in life. Okay? Money, position, and all of that. Now, many of you have probably heard that, the American Army was a segregated arm of the United States service forever. How many of you have heard that? Okay, there's one, a couple, but that's not true. Black soldiers served in all of the branches of the Army. Now, am I suggesting that there were hundreds of thousands of them? Absolutely not. But they served in the Corps of Engineers as early as the 1870s, as late as the turn of the century. They served in the Quartermaster Corps. They served in the Hospital Corps. They served in the Signal Corps. Okay, now guess what? Those were not segregated units. They were integrated units. And a black sergeant had just as much authority as a white sergeant. They lived in the same barracks. They lived in the same forts. They ate the same food. It was only in some of the infantry regiments, the combat arms, or the cavalry that you would see a predominantly amount of black soldiers. But were those units totally segregated? And this is open to all of you. In a reaction, what do you think? Am I boring everybody now? Anyone? No. And why so? The officers were all white. Okay? The officers of all of the units were white. Now, there would become a time in the 1870s where black officers finally graduated from West Point, and we all know who the first one was. Henry Ossian Flipper, class of 1877. His career lasted a little less than a decade, okay, before he was cashiered. Now, that was eventually changed. I think it was during the administration of President Clinton that he was finally given an honorable discharge, okay? But there were also, he was not the only black officer that served at West Point. John Alexander preceded him, Charles Young, and then there were about 5 others that went to the academy, and for one reason or another, during their 4th year, they were sent away. Okay, so opportunities still were there for blacks. It was just harder in the regular Army. In the National Guard, in the militia, you had black and white officers in these units from the very beginning. Okay? So the Army, as it was a unique place. But in all of my study, what I found that what the Army offered to my grandfather's generation, to my father's generation, to my generation, is something that is very clear and real. And I probably said this time and time again, a way up and a way out. It offered them economic opportunity that they could transfer to the civilian sector later on during the years. I'm talking about later on, the 1970s, 1918, the 1980s and 90s and to today. You had many African-American generals that transferred their service to other things. A very good friend of mine, Tony Jackson, was in the Army, served for about 4 years as a first and second lieutenant, and then did something that was bad. He transferred to the Marine Corps. Transferred to the Marine Corps. And 3 years ago, Tony Jackson retired as a 3-star Marine Corps general. His last base that he commanded was Camp Pendleton. Okay? So it happens in all of the services when the opportunities are there. People of color have had the opportunity to move forward, to move up. And that was the thing that the military offered to my grandfather's generation. If I knew how to work this silly thing, I would press the button, but that goes to the end, and maybe we can just have this going back and forth. But I would like to share with you, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and answers that you may have. This is a poem that was written by a guy named, I have to look and make sure, his name was John Henry Allen. He served with the 25th Infantry, out of Fort Huachuca. He served during World War I. Unfortunately, he died in France during World War I. But in 1910, he wrote this poem that my wife likes. And I've always thought it was something that was really telling about American soldiers. It's called The Rings Upon the Pike. Now, let me explain something about the rings. Now, today, you see battle streamers, that are on the regimental flags in the military. Prior to that, there were silver rings that were inscribed with the battle honors of the regiment. So this is what he's talking about. He says, "'Tis but a banner of azure blue goes floating by, woven of silken threads, the nation's coat of arms, the centerpiece. The standard on the right of her stars and stripes mount high, and all of our hopes and all of our strength for these. There's no need that we shall call them splendid. The rings upon the pike tell the tale of victories won, of how the brave defended that standard in those colors and not once did fail. Whether on Texas' sun-baked plains or in Dakota's tumbled badlands dear, marching through blinding snows and flooding rains, they met the red foeman in without fear. To keep the peace, they stood, the men at arms, and answered every call their chieftain sent. They beat back forest fires from settlers' farms and held in leash the mobs on murder bent. And when there came a call for foreign wars, did these men falter, that they fell that day? Look to the old men's battle scars, and there upon the pike San Juan in the sea. And in the murky damps of old Luzon, they builded campfires all the way, from Calocan to Bam Bam and back and on, across the mountain trails into the sea. And everywhere brought peace and happiness, and everywhere they put the foe to flight. And they who first engaged them in the fight returned to lay their arms down and to bless. There's no need that we call these colors splendid. The rings upon the pike, they tell the tale. It is that we, as they who have defended, shall now defend them and shall never fail. That was written in 1910 by a battalion sergeant major of the 25th Infantry. And as I said, he would die as a captain during World War I in France. But if you notice some of the things that I mentioned, they beat back forest fires from settlers' farms. Who do you think do that today? the Forest Service, the National Park Service, because what he was talking about was their duty in the national parks to preserve and to save the land. There was a story that was written about the men, and I have this on my slide view, but there were a great forest fire that occurred in Montana. Okay, no problem. The great forest fires in Montana and Idaho. These forest fires were so bad that the townspeople had to be taken away, okay? The soldiers of the 25th Infantry Company G were assigned to go into these towns, take the men and women and put them on the train, and take the train out. Now, the fire was blazing all around them. And these black soldiers, where do you think they were stationed? On the exterior of the train to keep the heat-crazed men and women from jumping out. That is the service that these men did. That was part of the Army's job of taking care of American citizens. And they did it without any problems at all. In those same parts of Idaho and Utah today, there are people that were not of that generation. They call them white supremacists that don't even allow black people to be near. And yet, if some of them were ancestors of those people that the 25th Infantry saved from the fires of that great fire of 1909, 1910. So it makes you wonder. But these men had no thought whatsoever than doing the duty that they were assigned to do. And that is whether taking care of the forest in Montana, taking care of the glaciers, taking care of the newly formed national parks in Hawaii, okay, building the roads up to the summits and stuff like that. That is what American soldiers did, and African American soldiers played a prominent part in that. And so what I want to do, and you can just let it go, just do the slides back and forth, but what I'd like to do is to entertain any questions that you may have in reference to the African American soldier. Because I did something very, very brief, but you may have things in your mind that you would like to know about, and I might be able to answer them for you. So please don't hesitate. Okay, there's the lady in the back.
Two questions. The first is, what do you know about the relationships that these men formed while serving? And how did they keep these relationships up, if they did, through the years? I assume they came from different parts of the country and were mixed into the different units. Second question is, did your grandfather ever talk about purging?
Okay. First question, how did they interact with each other during the time of service and after? Again, like anyone else, some got along, some did not. But one thing that I learned is when I started doing my research and my grandfather had a list of those soldiers that he knew, I was invited into their homes, carte blanche, okay? I traveled all over the country interviewing these soldiers. So yes, they kept in touch, okay? They formed the nucleus of Masonic organizations and things like that that they stayed with throughout their careers and after that. And as far as Pershing is concerned, yes, black soldiers knew Pershing. He served with the 10th Cavalry in the late 1880s. He was on leave during the portion of the 90s, but back with the regiment during the Cuban campaign, Spanish-American War. And then he would interact with these soldiers for the rest of his career. And every soldier that I interviewed had nothing but the deepest respect for John Blackjack Pershing. Anybody else, please?
What was your favorite war that you learned about?
My favorite war.
Or what was most interesting?
I guess the most interesting one was the Philippine-American War. And you might ask me why. Black soldiers prior to the Philippines had a desertion rate that was almost zero. They didn't desert, and there are reasons for it. The Army gave them the things that they needed. It was this economic position that in the civilian society was a position that everyone understood and respected, okay? The other reason is that the Philippines was an interesting war for two reasons. It was the first war in which black soldiers did something that they had not done heretofore. They deserted. Now, did they desert because they were cowards, because they didn't want to fight? They deserted because they felt that that war was an unconscionable war against a freedom-loving people. Now, there were only 12 of those soldiers that really deserted and joined the Filipino cause for liberty, okay? But the reasons were much different than you would think. You know, not because they were just tired of the Army or anything like that. They wanted to make a difference. Why? Because we believe in freedom. And they felt that what was happening at that particular time was taking the freedom away of a people of color. And so for the first time, they deserted. They joined the Philippine resistance. Now, they lost the war, and they lost their lives. These soldiers that were captured who didn't kill themselves were summarily executed publicly to show what America does to traitors. And so the issue is, were they traitors? Morally? No. But as soldiers of the United States Army, yes. Because they had signed and they had given their fealty to an oath of allegiance to our country. And even though they did it because they felt that things were going wrong, they did do it. So that was a war that I felt had repercussions that not only affected the soldiers there, but, you know, what was happening back at home. Because you have to think about these soldiers 10,000 miles away from home in this dense, impenetrable jungle of the Philippines, you know, were fighting for their lives. And at home, what was happening to American blacks? They're being burned at the stake. They're being lynched. The Filipino, I won't call them insurgents because they were not. The Filipino freedom fighters used this as a psychological thing to turn some of these soldiers. They would put leaflets on the, on the trail. Are you going to avenge what happened to so-and-so? They're using you for foods, and yet at home, they're burning you at the stake. And some of the soldiers were indeed affected by that and decided to take a stand. And that was the first time that that happened in the American Army for African American soldiers. Miss.
I have microphone.
President Truman, wasn't there some sort of order that he signed that integrated the military, because they were all segregated units, weren't they?
Yes. In 1941, when we became involved in World War II, the Army was not totally segregated. The auxiliary arms still had black and white soldiers serving together. By 1942, this had changed. Those units became segregated units. In 1948, Truman did sign the order to integrate the armed forces. Now, he signed it in 1948, but we went into the Korean War as a segregated army, okay? It wouldn't be until the end of the Korean War that the Army truly started to integrate itself. The last black unit was demobilized in 1957, almost 10 years after that, edict that Truman had signed. We went into the Vietnam War for the first time as an integrated army. And that's how we have fought ever since then. Okay, sir.
So, I don't know, I'm curious about numbers. So in the Civil War, you hear 180 to 200,000 African Americans in the USCT and the Navy together. Obviously, there's a great reduction at the end of the war, and you hear about the 9th and 10th and 24th and 25th infantry units. But of course, you're saying that there are other units that are, other division or departments that have integrated soldiers. So do you have some idea of the numbers of African Americans that are in this 1866 forward period? I know more units are raised for the Spanish-American War, and then hundreds of thousands are raised going into the First World War.
Yeah. In 1866, the Army was cut down from over 1 million soldiers to 27,000 officers and enlisted men. 1 in 5 soldiers in the United States Army after 1866 was black. Okay, 1 in 5. And that's a sizable amount. In 1898, with the authorization to build up the Army, 100,000 were brought into the Army in 1898. Now, these were primarily National Guard militia units and so forth. And there were black National Guard units and militia units that served during the Spanish-American War. At the end of 1902, the Army was reduced again, as is natural, when you're going into peacetime. The infantry branch was increased from 25 regiments to 35 regiments. There was no increase in black soldiers. The cavalry units were increased from 10 regiments to 14, and then a couple of years later, before the start of World War I, we had 17 cavalry regiments in the Army. Not one additional black unit, okay? So from the end of the Spanish-American War until the late 1920s, you saw a reduction of African Americans in the armed forces, numerically, okay? And so the only units that maintained their status as combat units were the traditional 4 units, okay? And by 1931, none of them were really combat units anymore, all right? But you still had your National Guard companies, National Guard battalions. You had the 8th Illinois, which was a full, complete regiment, but still the numbers had reduced. By 1939, the number of black soldiers in the Army was just pitiful. And blacks were clamoring because they knew that war was approaching. We want to have a part. And yet the government says, we don't need you. After Pearl Harbor, it became, everybody had to go in, okay? And things began to change, but not change. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. And I had one other. If you had any thoughts about Woodrow Wilson and his sort of issues with...
Well, where was
dealing
Woodrow Wilson from?
with the South?
What part of the
Virginia,
South?
actually, Stanton, Virginia. It's
Yeah.
just...
Woodrow Wilson was a product of his generation. And what was that generation known for? Unfortunately, racism. It was under Woodrow Wilson that Washington, D.C. became segregated. Black workers that had been working together with white and federal service had been pushed aside to separate places. Bathrooms had been changed. That was under Woodrow Wilson. And did any of those things change again? It would take a half century or more before things would normalize again. So that's as much as I think about Woody. Okay, yeah. But again, I have to say he was a product of his generation. Not everyone of that generation was like that, but the majority of the generation was what it was. Now, does that mean that every white person from the South that I know is no good? No, not at all. because they cannot be responsible for what happened 150 years ago or 50 years ago. Not at all. And I've traveled throughout the South, and one of the things that I've never done is put a chip on my shoulder. Never had anybody ready to knock it off. But reasonable dialogue, was the thing that helped me. And I just learned an awful lot, from both sides. The nicest people I ever met were in a place called Greenwood, Mississippi, both white and black. And when I first went there, I thought, oh, God, I'm from San Francisco, California. They're going to lynch me because they know I'm not one of them. But yet, the most wonderful people I've ever met. And it changed my attitude on people. I will not just use the brush and paint everyone as a racist because they come from a particular section. It has to be by their actions that they get the call. Anybody else? Yes.
I had a question, if you could speak just a little bit about family life for the soldiers, and I'm particularly thinking in the era of the West and the Southwest at the different forts, if family actually stayed with them at the fort, or if the soldiers went and served at different forts and then would come home to visit family.
Okay, very good. The family was an important part of military life for officers. Every single military reservation had quarters for officers and their family. Enlisted people, whether black or white, there was no provision for an enlisted man's family, none. Enlisted men's housing and all that stuff that we know today did not come into existence till after World War I. It was the prerogative of the base commander or the post commander. If your family could live on post in a deserted stable that could be rebuilt, okay? Black families, white families of that era stayed together, okay, on military post. Unfortunately, because of the times, the functions that they had, whether it was dancing, or regimental function, was, pretty much segregated, because of the conditions of the day. But the families were a very integral part of who these soldiers were about. And if you travel to any of the cemeteries in the Southwest, or San Francisco, or to the Presidio of Monterey, and you look at the tombstones, and you'll see tombstones of children, family members of soldiers who had died for disease or whatever, buried alongside regular soldiers of that era. So the Army became a much better place for an enlisted soldier after World War I. And you started getting all of these things that we see today, and we think that they were just, it's part of what it was. But it wasn't. And it was a process that took place. Your other half of your question was?
I think you covered it pretty much. I didn't know if the regiment moved to a different fort, whether the family would all move with them at the same time, or if they would stay.
No, they would all, generally, sometimes the family would stay until, things got settled, but the families always went. During the Philippine War, for the first 2 years, the only families that were allowed to go were officers' families. Okay, but after 1902, when the regiment started coming back, they would bring their families with them. And from that point on, you saw families of enlisted men and officers on all of the foreign posts where these soldiers served. Okay? Anybody else?
Yeah.
Don't be afraid.
I have a couple of questions following up on World War I. Now, it was clear that the 9th and 10th Cavalry were considered crack troops because they had gone to Spanish-American War. They served during the Indian Wars, but they were not called to go to Europe during World War I. And Pershing was basically the commanding officer. I can never understand why I probably know why they were not called to go to serve in the European theater of operations. The other question I have is that, can you...
Let me do this.
Okay.
Let me address the first one first, because I'm old. By the time I get to the second one, I may have forgotten it. Okay? So, the first one about the use of black troops in combat in France? The answer is they had a challenging duty to do on the Mexican border because the Mexican border was very unstable, very unstable. So these units, the 10th Cavalry was stationed at Fort Huachuca. The 25th Infantry would be brought over, and they were stationed at Nogales and a couple of smaller, forts on the border. The 25th Infantry was at New Mexico, Deming, at the time. So they were all on borders that were important borders of the time. The 9th Cavalry in 1915 had been sent back to the Philippines, and they would be there until 1922. Okay, but what the Army did was something that we see all the time. They took categories from those units to build the 92nd Infantry Division. So you had black soldiers, black senior NCOs from all 4 black regiments that formed the nucleus of the 92nd Infantry Division. And many of these men who were senior soldiers became officers after finishing their officers' course at Des Moines in 1917. All right.
So
but it was just an issue of where do you put those men? And you have to remember, World War I was not a cavalry war. The horse was almost obsolete with the new weapons of war that we had. But the borders that we were defending, the cavalry was in a place that, they did best.
Okay, so they were, so the NCOs were assigned, I guess, to the New York units and to the Illinois
No.
units?
The NCOs were assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, which was a complete infantry division with all of its auxiliary arms, quartermaster, signal, hospital, artillery, all of that. Those men were assigned to that division as officers and enlisted men. And the regiments did go to France in 1918 and served in the Meuse-Argonne and other places. The 93rd Infantry Division was a National Guard division, except for one regiment, okay? The 372nd was a draft unit from North and South Carolina, okay? But the other 4 units, and they only had their infantry arm, just the 4 infantry regiments of the 93rd.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, does that mean to say that black soldiers got this great break during World War I? Well, they didn't. Okay. There was a lot of controversy, dealing with World War I. That was something that I can write another book about.
Okay,
Yes. Oh,
I'm sorry. My second question.
Okay.
Almond, General Almond of the 92nd Rainbow Division.
World War II.
World War II, yes.
Racist.
Okay, you sort of preceded.
Absolutely, unequivocally.
So-
That's exactly what he
So
was.
was he the commander at the time the 24th Infantry went to Korea? The reason I'm asking, because as you know, the 24th Infantry got a bad deal there.
Yeah.
Was Almond the CO at the time?
He was one.
Okay.
Now, he was the commander of the army that went to Korea.
Was that were they ever absolved?
Well, they truly, really weren't called cowards, okay? Not the 2-4, not in Korea. They held their ground as much as any American unit in Korea. They fought from the bottleneck in the south all the way to the Yalu River, okay? North Korea was done and finished before 1 million Chinese crossed the Yalu and pushed us all the way back across the demilitarized zone. And the 24th Infantry did quite well. Yes, they were demobilized. They weren't demobilized because the unit was ineffective. They were demobilized because the other units needed senior personnel to beef up these units. And this was part of the integration, of the Army. And it just so happened the integration took a speedy course during the first 2 years of the Korean War. Yes.
I may have been asleep during history class, but I don't recall ever learning about the Buffalo Soldiers in high school. The first time I came across that term was hearing a Bob Marley song, and so it took a Jamaican reggae artist to educate me about African Americans serving in the American Army. I wonder if you have any comment about how we can better educate young people about the service that blacks have given to this country and continue to give, so that we can maybe nip racism in the bud. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, you know, it is true that there was not much written about the actions of African American soldiers. I mean, again, you have to understand the time period in which you lived. You know, you look maybe a little bit younger than me, but I mean, that time period, it was not the thing to do to prop up, you know, what these men did. It's only been the last 30 to 40 years, you know, that there has been a lot written on the subject of African American soldiers. And I think at the end of the day, what we all have to do to nip racism in the bud is look in the mirror. And what do you see? My philosophy, when I look in the mirror, what I see is good and evil. Well, what does that mean? That means it's up to me to decide what I want to do. And I think all of us have free choice. I think our current generation of young people have it so much better than my generation. I was just as racist as everybody else was because that's what I grew up around, okay? But these young people today really don't have that as much as we had it. And I think we could look to them to look to the future, because they don't look like we did at the continents of someone's skin. They look at the character of the person. I work with young people all the time, you know, in the Silicon Valley in California, and I see them all the time. And I said, God, you know, this is a good thing for us as a people, as a nation, you know, to have young people that can put this stuff aside. And I'm not suggesting that racism doesn't exist, because it does. But let me tell you a secret. I know as many black races as I know white. I know as many Asian races as I know black. Hispanic races as I know them all. So the bottom line is what we do as individuals to change this. And I think we can, you know. But it starts with changing that person in the mirror first. Then you can change the world. And so with me studying my grandfather, it was important for me to learn exactly who this man was who took the time to raise this 10-year-old kid. You know, why did he do the things that he did? I look back on my generation and I think about sometimes we are a whiny bunch of people. Really whiny and crying. Some of it legitimate, some of it not. I talk to a lot of people of my generation and I still get the same things that I heard years ago. They owe me. Well, hell, who is they? Look in the mirror. They. That's they. You owe you. You change you, and you'll be surprised the phenomenal effect it could have on the world. And you may not see it in your lifetime, okay? But I believe in good karma. I think that you will see the process as it goes, maybe in the next life. Yeah. But that's my stump on that issue. Any other questions dealing with anything? And I have to tell you, when I first started out, I was an ancient history professor. I loved the Roman Empire. And I could name every single emperor from Julius Caesar to the last Romulus Augustulus in order in succession. I loved the Roman Empire because it showed me what an empire could do and what it could not do. One of the things that I learned about Rome, and I look at Europe today, with the Commonwealth, you know, the European Union, and I look at what the Romans did 2,000 years ago, when they subjugated a country, after a couple of generations, who were these people calling themselves? Roman. From Britannia to Germania, from Asia to the Danube, North Africa. They were all Romans. And can't we think from a universal perspective and say, we may not be all Romans, but we're all humans. And we inhabit the only globe that we know of right today that is our home. And so the old cliche, you know, the world is a nation or it takes a nation, well, it takes all of us, you know, to do what we can do to make changes. And it doesn't mean you still don't have to study history or all those things that we did do, because that's very important. And I think he's standing up. My time is up.
I'd like to say that this has been an illuminating discussion, and I want to commend you for providing us with this excellent presentation. So please join me in giving him a robust
Thank you.
applause.